wrote an extensively research on the Boones. John Filson lived during the settling of Kentucky. He interviewed settlers and leading citizens. Lyman Draper published 10 volumes of historical notes. Even though he never finished his biographies, his correspondence with survivors of the time and their relatives provide the largest single first-hand account of the settlement of the region. Now I want to tell you a story about my 5th great-grandparents, their parents and grandparents, and their children and grandchildren. Much has been written about Daniel Boone and his brothers Israel, Squire, and George, but little about his sisters. Sarah, named after her mother Sarah, as was the custom, was the oldest child of Squire, and his wife, Sarah Morgan Boone, was born June 1724, 10 years before her brother Daniel Boone in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Sarah and her siblings were reared in the Quaker religion. There was a child born about every 2 years for 22 years to Squire and Sarah Morgan Boone. Squire was a short, red-headed, blue-eyed Scotsman, and Sarah was tall, of Welsh origin, with dark eyes and hair. Quaker George Boone sent his 3 oldest children, George, Sarah, and Squire, to Pennsylvania in 1712 from Bradnich, Devonshire, England, to scope out Penn's colony for his family. While there, 23-year-old George married Deborah Howell in 1713 in Philadelphia. They had 10 children, 3 by the time their parents arrived. 24-year-old Sarah Boone married Jacob Stover in 1715 in Philadelphia. They had 3 of their 10 children by the time their parents arrived in 1717. This couple moved to Virginia by 1733 when their youngest child, Mary Stover, was born. 24-year-old Squire Boone married Sarah Morgan in 1720 in Gwinnett Township. They married after his parents arrived in Pennsylvania. They had 12 children. George returned to England in 1717 with his new wife and 3 small children to visit, while Sarah and Squire stayed in Pennsylvania. August 1717, Patriarch George Boone moved with his family, Mary Moggeridge, and their remaining 6 children to America. He purchased land and continued his weaving business. 11 of their 12 children married and had families. In 1720, 24-year-old Squire Boone married Sarah Morgan in Gwinnett Township. Squire, Sarah's father, purchased 250 acres in the county, He purchased 250 acres in the county out of Exeter Township, where he and his wife, Sarah Morgan, originally lived, in a 16 by 20 one-room stone home with a loft. It was not uncommon for a family of 12 to live in this small space that included eating, social, and sleeping. As their family grew, some rooms were added. Over time, Squire built a grist mill to grind their wheat and corn crops, a blacksmith shop, and a weaving cabin that held 6 looms. By 1730, 6-year-old Sarah, being the oldest child, brought water in from the well for drinking and washing. She also helped with the younger children with cooking, keeping the fire going, pulling weeds in the garden, and watering the plants. Children were in charge of feeding and watering all the animals. They had to milk the cows and collect the chicken eggs. They would gather fruit and vegetables from the garden and would sometimes run errands for their parents. The girls were in charge of sweeping, cooking, turning butter, knitting, and weaving, sewing. To sew, the women would need thread, so they would first have to shear the sheep to get their wool. They would use a spinning wheel to spin the wool into thread. Girls would also help make candles and soap. To make candles, they would tie a string to a stick, then put the strings in a pot of boiling wax and tallow. Once they had the first coating of wax, they would let it harden. Then they would keep doing this until the candle was the perfect thickness. Not all was work, however. Children and adults alike would play games like checkers, marbles, London Bridge is falling down, rolling the hoop, leapfrog, hide and seek, seesaw, ring around the rosy. Ah, had that in there twice, sorry about that. George Fox taught that each person has an inner light, part of God's spirit inside them. So there was a unity between all human beings. He also counseled them that God is the principal person in their lives. People should not be baptized, should not have rituals like sacrament. It was not necessary to keep records such as marriages. William Penn, however, deviated from George Fox in that he had American friends keep very careful, detailed records and counseled them that baptism should not be a single act of initiation, but a continuing growth in the Holy Spirit. So initial baptisms were conscientiously required. The one original dogma that the American Quakers followed was to bury their dead in unmarked graves. In 1739, there was a smallpox epidemic. Mother Sarah kept all her children inside, and they were forbidden to go out except to do necessary chores. 5-year-old Daniel did not like being confined, nor did his 7-year-old sister Elizabeth. They decided if they got smallpox, and once they were over it, they would be able to see their friends and play outside. So they snuck out one night and visited the Clausens, who were all sick with smallpox. Then they both got the smallpox, and their mother was really upset. Then the entire Boone family came down with the smallpox. Once over it, one will not get it again. I think I'm out of order. Neighboring American tribes were not so lucky. They had absolutely no resistance to smallpox, and it was lethal because they had no previous exposure to it, no immunity. Native Americans suffered 80 to 90% population losses in most of America with those diseases of European origin like influenza, typhoid, measles, mumps, syphilis, smallpox, and bubonic plague taking the greatest toll in devastating epidemics that were compounded by significant loss of leadership. In 1742, 21-year-old John Wilcoxson and his brother Isaac left the farm to seek work after their mother Elizabeth died the year before, leaving their 9 other brothers and sisters at the family farm. George, their father, had passed away the year before the mother. Squire Boone apprenticed John and Isaac to make cloth and had them shore up the grist mill that had been damaged in the harsh winter heavy snow that left it cave in. Brother George Wilcoxson joined them later. He was the same age as Sarah's brother Daniel, who played pranks on poor George. During this time, Squire Boone allowed the young men to live with his family. Did Squire meet the boys and their parents, George and Elizabeth, through yearly Quaker meetings? Sarah found herself in a family way and married John Wilcoxson, May 29, 1742. Squire and daughter Sarah were both chastised by the Friends for marrying out. Many researchers assumed this meant that John was not a Quaker. Was John a Quaker? His grandfather John's house was licensed for Quakers to meet for religious worship. Both sets of grandparents, John Wilcoxson and his wife Dorothy Hall and Roland Powell and Maud Richards, were Quakers. And his parents, George Wilcoxson and Elizabeth Powell, were Quakers. Quakers expected young couples to go to 3 monthly meetings in succession declaring their intentions to marry. And then at the third meeting, they would generally receive permission and then were married. Sarah and John did not go through this process. Sarah wrote an apology to the friends. Squire also wrote an apology to the friends, stating that he should have been more observant, that he was in a great strait not knowing what to do, seeing he was somewhat sensible, that they had been too conversant before. When Sarah had baby David 5 months later, the good committee of Quaker ladies gathered and counted backwards to discover Sarah was with child when she married. She was disowned. Sarah was not the only Boone to be chastised by the church. There were several other incidents, including her grandfather, George Boone, who was chastised by the church members because he had not sought their permission in allowing the courtship between his daughter, Mary, and Quaker John Webb. Just how this was contrary to the rules and regulations of the society, we are not told. But George Boone acknowledged his fault in a meeting. This is Sarah's Aunt Mary and her father, Squire's sister. Anytime a young couple's courtship did not meet with the approval of the meeting, both father and child were publicly chastised. By 1744, Sarah's brother Israel worked in their father's blacksmith shop. The Boone farm had a separate weaving cabin where 6 looms were set up, where they made linsey woolsey, a combination of linen and wool cloth, where the Boone children Samuel, Jonathan, Mary, George, and Edward worked. Raising cows and crop farming made a busy, self-sufficient home place. Young Daniel and Sister Elizabeth brought home berries and other food found outdoors. Daniel brought home small game he killed with his homemade club. He could kill a rabbit at 10 yards. The Quakers were friendly with the local Indians. Penn and his Quakers made it a point to treat the Indians as they would any other residents. They negotiated over land instead of taking it outright. They shared food, children played and hunted together, and the Indians taught Boone children survival skills. The Boones fed passing Indian families. This led to semi-friendly relations with the Delaware and members of the Iroquois Confederacy. Summer of 1744, Squire purchased a 25-acre tract near Olney to graze his cattle, 6 miles north of his Exeter homestead. He built a rough cabin where Daniel and his mother with 1-year-old Squire lived, milking the cows and making butter and cheese. 10-year-old Daniel would let the cows out of the pen in the morning and return them in the evening. During the day, he would hunt small game with the club he made, gather berries and what food was to be found. Each weekend, they would return to the homestead to store the butter and cheese in the cellar. In the meantime, 20-year-old Sarah helped take care of the children ranging from 4 to 18, along with the womanly chores of the cabin. She also had her 2-year-old David and was expecting another child. Squire gave 11-year-old Daniel a muzzle-loading rifle with which to hunt. Daniel began bringing in larger game for family meals. A couple of years later, Sarah's 13-year-old brother, Daniel, you notice he keeps getting older, decided to go night hunting with a group of boys. Daniel and his friend Henry Miller, Squire's blacksmith apprentice, snuck out and climbed on Father Squire's favorite horse to hunt wild game. Racing on the way back at a full gallop, there was a cow lying in the middle of the lane. All Daniel could do was to grab the reins tighter and urge the horse to jump over the cow. As the horse was leaping, the startled cow stumbled to its feet. The animals collided, sending Daniel and Henry tumbling to the ground. The cow ran off, but the horse had broken its neck and died in the fall. Daniel took the saddle and bridle off and left the horse. His father never did know the real story of how the horse ended up dead. In 1747, Israel Boone, Sarah's oldest brother, 2 years younger than she was chastised for marrying Martha Ann Farmer, a Dutch girl. The Quaker Committee was not as forgiving toward the Boone family as it had been in the past. Parents Squire and Sarah Boone were asked for an explanation as to why they had allowed a second child to entertain the idea of what it considered a disorderly marriage. But Squire stood his ground and said she was a worthy woman, and he did not believe an explanation was necessary, and he refused to write a letter, even though his wife urged him to do so. He insisted that there was nothing wrong with the girl other than she was a worldling, and he said that his children would marry as they pleased. Half a century before, his father had dissented from the Church of England. Now Squire Boone braced himself to reject the dissenters. Squire was banned from attending Quaker meetings, but his wife Sarah remained in good standing. Israel was disowned by the Exeter meeting. The name of Squire Boone was never again mentioned in the minutes of the Exeter Friends. There was talk of another place to the southwest, the Yadkin River Valley of North Carolina. It was a long way, perhaps 500 miles, which would take just over a month to travel. Nowadays, about 10 hours by car. The route followed the valley of the Shenandoah, a natural passageway between Blue Ridge and the Appalachians, the Cumberland Trail, or the Great Valley Road. Squire's sister Sarah and her husband Jacob Stover had gone on early to Virginia and eventually came to own 10,000 acres. As for the Yadkin, the Boones had heard that it was a beautiful country with warm, sunny climate and abundant wild game. There were said to be so many bears in the autumn that common hunters could kill enough to make 2,000 to 3,000 weight of bear bacon. In 1748, many Quaker Friends began moving to Virginia and North Carolina. Now Squire decided to go. There was a family conference, and the lure of new frontier won over the family. Squire busied himself disposing of his land, his holdings, and everything that was too bulky to fit into a covered wagon. That he had as yet no fixed idea about where they were bound is made clear by the fact that Mother Sarah, who clung to her faith, armed herself with letters from Exeter Friends, attesting to her merits and orderliness, and addressed to meetings in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. The Boones, their 8 unmarried children, 3 married children and their families, their nephews John and George Boone, and apprentice Henry Miller set off on the morning of May 1st, 1750. Some wagons, 5 horses, cows, sheep, chickens tied by their feet, and wagons, Conestoga and open. They traveled 15 miles a day through the Cumberland Valley. The children rode, legs dangling, and women walked alongside. Most of the older boys were at the rear, shooing the cattle along, but 16-year-old Daniel was up front. The men marched ahead or alongside, keeping a keen eye open for Indian or other enemy in the wild, their rifles under arm or over shoulder. Periodically, Mother Sarah would mount a horse with her 4-year-old child Hannah. They crossed the Susquehanna, then followed the crudely cut road south into the Cumberland Valley. Beneath the bluffs where the Shenandoah joined the Potomac. At a ford, a ferryman named Robert Harper took them across into Virginia. After 17 days of travel, they stopped in Augusta County for about 18 months, where Squire's sister Sarah's widowed husband, Jacob Stober, lived. Squire purchased 640 acres of land near the Yadkin River, now Rowan County, North Carolina, then moved his family again. They went through the Cumberland Valley, past several small towns, then further down the valley, following the Yadkin River to the Philadelphia Road, and then through the Shenandoah Valley. The Catawba Indians had cleared the land, then settlers moved into the area the Indians had cleared, pushing them off their land. In October 1751, the Boones settled on their own land. During this time, Great Britain and her colonies changed from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. You may be confused about double dates in the mid-1700s, and rightly so. The beginning of the year 1752, previously March 25th, was changed to January 1st. So if you find a document that dates between January and March 24th before the year 1752, know that in modern terms, you need to add a year. You might have seen dates written as 1750/51, which means the year as it was known then and the year as it's known now. It does not mean between 1750 and 1751, as we would normally think. Back in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII had reformed the Julian calendar, which was being used. The Julian calendar did not match the solar year. Other Catholic countries adopted the Gregorian calendar, except England, which was a Protestant country and did not want to follow the Catholic created calendar. So England was always 10 days behind what is called the New Style calendar. By the year 1752, England was 11 days behind other European countries. Colonists went to bed on September 2nd, 1752, and woke up the next morning on September 14th, 1752. A drop of 11 days in between to conform to the Gregorian calendar. In Scotland, however, January 1st became the first day of the year in 1600. The next day after, December 31st, 1599. And you can see there was a real mess for about 150 years in all of Europe and England and all over the place in the colonies. I'm not even going to mention the regnal years, which were reckoned by the years a certain ruling monarch had been on the throne. You might see 1 Elizabeth I as the date, which was the first year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, based on her reign. This would be somewhere between November 17, 1558 and November 16, 1559. Dates that don't make sense, like siblings born in the same year, less than 9 months apart, or the death of a father more than a year before a child was born, are explained by the calendar change. Back to the Boones. The Boones lived in a cave while building their homes. The original log cabin of John and Sarah Boone Wilcoxson was built about 1752 on the south end of Bear Creek, has survived, and over the years has been incorporated into newer sections of a larger private home. The original part of the house was a 17 by 33-foot room with floor planks 3 inches thick and over a foot wide. The planks were wide enough that only 14 were used. There was a narrow staircase to the loft where the children slept. In their 1500 in their 560 square foot house, they cooked, ate, socialized, and slept. At the same time, the French were bribing the Shawnees and other tribes to attack the homesteaders. This was the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. 1755, fellow soldier of the French and Indian War, John Finley, told Daniel Boone about fertile land over the mountains. When Daniel returned home, he told his family about the part of the war he had seen. The British lined up in their bright clothing, ready for combat, while the French and Indians hid behind trees and attacked them. Most of the British were killed. Remember, the colonists were still under British rule, and Daniel was fighting with them. John WILCOXSON was an Indian fighter, and the cabin he built on Bear Creek was probably used as a fort during Indian attacks. His cabin had been expanded from 560 to 1,300 square feet. 2 bedrooms, 2 large stone fireplaces, a living room, a spacious kitchen, a large detached shed, and of course, an outhouse. In 1756, Brother Israel Boone got tuberculosis and died. His wife, Martha Ann Farmer, died also, leaving 3 daughters and 2 sons. Daniel married Rebecca Bryan, and they took Israel's 2 sons, Jesse and Jonathan, to raise as their own. Sarah gathered the daughters, Mary, Jemima, and Sarah, into her own family. During this time, Daniel Boone would leave home several months at a time to trap and kill animals for their fur and pelts. He did not waste meat from the animals, but would cure it to take it home for his family and friends. He would take various family members with him on hunting trips. In 1758, gangs of white bandits flooded into the area along the western border of North Carolina. February 1760, Shawnee warriors from Ohio swept down and raided the border between North Carolina and Virginia, killing a number of Yadkin Valley settlers, burning fields, stealing supplies, and murdering anyone who got in their way. Cherokee warriors from the south killed a number of Sarah's neighbors in the Yadkin settlement. The Indians were not the only ones creating mayhem. A group of settlers passing through the area kidnapped and scalped some warriors. March 1760, Sarah and John WILCOXSON and other Boone families with some Morgans and Bryans moved back to Culpeper County, Virginia, taking only the necessities and leading a pack horse train northeast along the Georgia River. After 200 miles, about 2 weeks of travel, they arrived in Culpeper County. By the end of 1762, the WILCOXSON and allied families returned to their ransacked and looted homes and planted wheat and rye. Now that the Indian Wars were over, hundreds of settlers surged into the area. Within a year, Yadkin was a booming town. Records show that John WILCOXSON owned land, was constable, witnessed deeds, and helped build roads. January 1765, Father Squire Boone died. Sarah's mother went to live with her daughter Mary, William Bryan's wife. The same year, 5 men traveled through Yadkin and told Daniel Boone that King George III promised 100 acres to everyone who settled in Florida. Daniel Squire and Sister Hannah's newlywed husband, John Stewart, went to Florida with 5 men. John Stewart got lost from the group for 5 days. Huge bugs and swampland with mud up to one's knees were not attractive. Daniel, Squire, and John returned to their North Carolina home. May 1, 1769, Daniel and Brother Squire set out through the Cumberland Gap. It was a trail created by buffalo. It was used by tribes of Native Americans that remained in this area, mostly Cherokee and Shawnee, who used the trace to hunt and make attacks on each other. The trace or path was known by the Indians as the Path of the Armed Ones, or the Great Warrior's Path. Over this trail, more than 300,000 settlers walked and rode over the next 35 years. January 1st, Mother Sarah Morgan died. 1770, Daniel and his brother-in-law, John Stewart, husband of his baby sister Hannah, went into Kentucky to trap for fur and pelts. John was injured by the Indians and Daniel was captured and robbed. Then he escaped. John's body was found a few years later, tucked into the bottom of a hollow tree. Daniel recognized his powder horn with initials JS John had carved into it. September 1773, Daniel and his family and brother Squire and about 40 of Rebecca Bryan's relatives, all men, joined the traveling party to be the first settlers to go through the Cumberland Gap. They carried just a few household items with necessities for setting up home in the wilderness with them: a butter churn, some 20-gallon kettles, a flour sifter. Cattle and hogs were driven along, while chickens with their legs tied were carried on one of the pack horses. Baby Jessie, 5-year-old Rebecca, and little Daniel Morgan all traveled in woven hickory baskets strapped to the horses, while the 5 other children, Lavina, Jemima, Susanna, Israel, and 16-year-old James, walked alongside their parents. Nephews Jonathan and Jesse stayed in North Carolina since Jesse was married and Jonathan had a girlfriend. There was only a mere buffalo trail, wide enough for only one horse at a time to pass. Food for the journey and seeds needed to plant crops took up most of the space on the pack horses. They met up with Captain Russell and David Gass, who were not ready to leave, so the caravan went on ahead. Daniel realized this was going to take longer than he anticipated, so he sent his 16-year-old son, James, and John and Richard Mendenhall back to ask Captain Russell to get additional supplies for the journey. On the morning of October 10th, 1773, Tom Hall came galloping into camp crying that James, the Mendenhall boys, Henry Russell, Isaac Crabtree, Michael Drake, and 2 slaves, Charles and Adams, had been attacked by Indians, killed, scalped, and mutilated. The group turned back to North Carolina. March 1775, much of the Cherokee claim on 20 million acres in Kentucky was purchased by Richard Henderson through the Transylvania Land Purchase. Henderson told Daniel he would give him 2,000 acres if he would build a road, which became the Wilderness Road. Daniel never got his land. March 10th, 1775, Daniel, brother Squire's daughter Susanna, and her husband William Hayes and crew began building the Wilderness Road following the Warriors Trail that led to Kentucky. 3 weeks later, a group of warriors attacked the camp and killed one of the road builders, Twitty, his slave, Sam, and Twitty's bulldog. Walker was seriously injured in the attack. Several men picked up their belongings and headed back through the Cumberland Gap. The Boones, the Morgans, and Bryants were very close families, and Daniel Boone frequently visited. April 6, 1775, the road was completed and Daniel built Fort Boone, which later became Boonesboro. Cleverly, the homes were built in a rectangle close together with boards in between them to build the fort with the 4 corners on lookout stations. Daniel again took his family and settlers into the wilderness to live at the fort. Daniel was concerned about the preservation of wildlife. He had seen men hunt and kill buffalo for sport, cutting off the hump or the tongue of the animal, leaving the carcass to rot where it had fallen. The battles of Lexington and Concord occurred in April 1775. 14th of July, 1776, Daniel's daughter Jemima Boone with Francis and Elizabeth Calloway were captured by a band of Indians where the girls were in a canoe on the Kentucky River within sight of Boonesboro. Daniel and other men, including 14-year-old Flanders Calloway, Jemima's future husband and brother of Francis and Elizabeth, followed the Indians and regained the girls the next day. In 1777, Daniel Boone and 29 men were camped beside Licking River at Lower Blue Licks Spring to leach salt from the water. Daniel was captured by the Shawnee, who planned to attack the other men who were leaching salt. Daniel made agreement with Chief Blackfish to have the men surrender rather than getting them killed.
Yeah, that
Daniel
was a
had
big.
hunted with the men
They
and
hated him for that. They thought he was a friend of the Indians.
well, he was a friend of the Indians, yes, but not these particular Indians. Chief Blackfish to have the men surrender rather than getting killed. Daniel had hunted with the men and they trusted him. These are the men that were leaching the salt. The captured men were marched north to Chief Blackfish's village in the future state of Ohio, where Daniel was adopted as Chief Blackfish's son, and other of the captured men replaced Shawnee men of the tribe who had died. This was the way of the Shawnee. The remaining men were sold to the British as captives. The Shawnees planned on attacking Fort Boonesboro and greatly outnumbered the settlers there. Daniel escaped and traveled 160 miles to warn Boonesboro. He arrived after having only one meal, worn, tired, and exhausted. Daniel helped the men to get organized for an attack. In September 1778, Fort Boonesboro, 440 Indians and 12 French Canadians surrounded the fort and demanded surrender while displaying British and French flags. The Indians were led by Shawnee Chief Blackfish. The fort only had about 60 men and boys to defend it, and yet the settlers voted to fight instead of surrender. For 2 days, Daniel Boone pretended to negotiate a treaty while the settlers slipped food, cattle, hogs, horses, and supplies into the fort. Finally, after the Indians attempted to grab the Kentuckians at the negotiations, the battle for Fort Boonesboro began. They attempted to torch the fort, pretending they had left the area, and began several tunnels from the riverbank to the fort. So desperate were their settlers that Daniel fashioned 2 wooden cannons out of logs. One cannon managed to get off one shot before it burst. Little food was left after a week of fighting. Then a heavy rain developed one night, and when it ceased, the sound of digging in the tunnel could no longer be heard. The heavy rain caved in the tunnels and caused the Shawnees to quit the 7 to 11-day siege. The following morning, the people from Fort Boonesboro came out and searched for the Indians, but they had gone. As a result, Daniel Boone, having the salt leaching men surrendered to the Shawnee, he was brought to trial as a traitor and subsequently acquitted. Sarah Boone's husband, John Wilcoxson, was a soldier of Virginia, was Kentucky County, Virginia. The children of John Wilcoxson Sr. also came to early Kentucky. In 1775, Samuel Wilcoxson, Rachel Wilcoxson Bryant with her husband William Bryant, and David Wilcoxson. Daniel Wilcoxson was in the Kentucky by 1777 and was stationed as a soldier at Fort Boonesboro in late 1778 to 1779, and at Bryan Station 1779 July to fall of 1783. Israel Wilcoxson lived north of Bryan Station by 1779, and he died there in 1781. In 1779, John and Sarah Boone Wilcoxson moved to Western Virginia, now Kentucky, and lived at Fort Boonesboro. Then they moved to Bryan Station a bit further west. Their son Daniel, my fourth great-grandfather, built a cabin just north of Bryan Station. Winter 1779 was the worst winter in the United States history to that date. October 1780, Sarah's brother Edward Boone was sitting on a log cracking and eating walnuts while on a trip with his brother Daniel, waiting while Daniel was off killing a bear. The Shawnees came upon him and killed him. The Shawnees thought they had killed Daniel since the brothers looked very much alike. 1781, Daniel was elected to represent Kentucky County in the Virginia Assembly. March 1782, 300 militiamen crossed the Ohio River and attacked a peaceful village of Delaware Indians. Over 60 women and children and 36 men were killed. In 1782, Sarah's husband, John Wilcoxson, was killed by Indians close to Bryan Station. Another source said that John died in 1798 in North Carolina. Sarah Boone Wilcoxson lived with various children after her husband John died, and she died in 1815 at her daughter Elizabeth Cutbirth's home. There is confusion between John Wilcoxson, who married Sarah Boone, John Wilcoxson Jr., who married Sarah Knotson, and Sarah's niece Sarah, who married John Wilcox. As a result, DAR no longer accepts Sarah Boone previously accepted service as a patriot. She must be reproved, as do Daniel, George, Squire, and redheaded William Boone, among others. Also, John Wilcoxson must be reproved along with their son Daniel. There are 73 DAR members, including supplementals, who use Sarah Boone Wilcoxson as a patriot, who were accepted by DAR. 119 were approved through John Wilcoxson, her husband, and 31 through their son Daniel, who was a captain in Holder's Company, June 1779. In 1799, Daniel never received his promised land. Daniel sold his trading post he had set up in 1791 and moved to Indian, Upper Louisiana Territory, now Missouri. Daniel said, "While it may have been necessary to fight them, I am very sorry I ever killed a Shawnee. They have been kinder to me and kept their word more often than the white people I know." And that concludes my talk. Are there questions?
Well, thank you, Karen. That was very interesting.
Oh, you're welcome.